I'm the history guy, and I'm here in Bovington, England, where the world-famous Tank Museum has asked me to list my top 5 tanks. But of course, I'm the history guy, so I'm all about forgotten history. So what I'm going to be doing is searching this museum's extraordinary collection for 5 tales of forgotten history that deserve to be remembered. This is an odd-looking vehicle indeed. The bottom looks like a tank, but the top looks like sort of a bathtub, and you might even say it's not a tank at all. It doesn't have a turret, it doesn't have a gun, but what's most important in combat is getting the vehicles where you need them to be, and that's where the Beach Armored Recovery Vehicle, or Barb, comes into play. The idea of Barbs came from the granddaddy of amphibious invasions, the D-Day invasion in 1944, when 60 M4A2 Sherman tanks were modified as Barbs to help to clear the landing areas. You know, when you have an amphibious invasion, you're going to get all sorts of stuff that's stuck in the way. There might be a tank broken down or knocked out. There might be landing craft or vehicles that are stuck. And what the Barb does is it's able to wade into the surf and move those out of the way using sheer brute force. So this could be used, for example, to push a landing craft onto shore or to push it out to sea. This could be used to push a disabled tank out of the way of a landing lane, or this could even be used to anchor boats. And so these are what allow you to get the vehicles in, because in an amphibious invasion, what's most important is to get as much stuff on shore as fast as possible. And those Sherman Barbs were so effective that they continued using them. The British Army continued using them clear into the 1950s, well after they'd stopped using all other kinds of Shermans. But the problem was it came a point where the Sherman simply didn't have enough oomph to push around a modern vehicle. And so they decided to create this, a Barb that's built on a Mark III Centurion hull, and the 12 of these were produced in 1963. Barbs served aboard amphibious assault ships, HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid. This particular vehicle served on both at different times. The engine was moved to the back of the superstructure for accessibility, and the exhaust vents moved to the top of the structure. The superstructure is only 25 millimeters thick, which is, well, not very much, given that the Barb would be one of the first vehicles into the combat zone and would be expected to operate under fire. For defense, the best way to operate was to go as deep as possible, using the water for cover. A Centurion Barb could operate in up to 2.9 meters of water. The Centurion Barb saw extensive service in the Falklands War in 1982, when the landing at San Carlos was done under fire, and so this was critical for getting the vehicles and the equipment and the men there as quickly as possible. And it was continued to be used clear up until 2003 in the Gulf War, but in 2003 the Centurion Barb was replaced with a vehicle that's based on the Leopard 1. You know, this is truly a unique vehicle. Without these service vehicles, which people don't really think of when they think about tanks, but without these you wouldn't be able to get the battle tanks where they need to be. And the fact that this unique vehicle is preserved here at Bovington shows how amazing this museum is, and that's why the Centurion Barb is my number 5 tank. If you've ever been to the Tank Museum's Vehicle Conservation Center, you might have wondered, what's that weird tank that has a grass skirt? Well, that's my number 4 tank on the list. This is the Chieftain Signature Integration Demonstrator, or SID, based on a Chieftain Mark XII, and it's an early attempt at a stealth tank. Now, it's interesting because when you think of stealth for a ground vehicle, what you try to mask is either sound or heat signature, but there's some parts of the SID that are built to mask the radar signature. So, for example, look how squared off it is, and some of this is actually made out of wood. It looks almost more like a Challenger 2 than it looks like a Chieftain. And the paint you have to be careful with because it's radar-absorbent paint, and that can be quite caustic, and you want to breathe this stuff in. Radar-absorbent paint is pretty cool stuff. It essentially has shapes built in that resonate with the radar signal, dissipating the waves as heat so that fewer will bounce back to the radar. Radar-absorbing paint was around as early as the Second World War, where the paint was applied to German U-boats. But again, the stealth of ground vehicles is not usually about radar signature, so it isn't exactly clear how this experimental tank was used. Then there are the brushed dust flaps and the blanked road wheels, which were probably to mask dust, but also been to square off the shape to mask the radar signature as well. There's still a lot we don't know about the SID. We don't really know what lessons the British Army derived from the SID, but some of the things that they used on the SID were incorporated into the Challenger 2, and the fact that we don't know the whole story tells us that probably there was some other stuff discovered that the British Army still doesn't want you to know. Part of this is a bit of forgotten history. But the SID is important not just because it's an interesting test bed and it made contribution to modern tank designs, but because this is an absolutely unique test vehicle, and that shows how extraordinary the collection here is at the Tank Museum at Bovington, because otherwise this tank would just be forgotten history. So my number 3 tank is a proper tank, the Matilda 1, but admittedly, it's kind of a goofy tank. It didn't have an anti-tank gun, just a machine gun, only had a crew of 2, and as you can see here, the driver didn't have a lot of space. The commander behind him was trying to command the turret and the machine gun while he was also still trying to command the tank, but there is some brilliance in the design of the Matilda 2. In order to make it cheap and easy to build, they used as much as possible standard parts, so this tank ran just on a standard Ford V8 engine, and because of that, they were able to build 140 of these between 1937 and 1940, which was a large number for the British in between the wars. The Matilda 1 saw service with the British Expeditionary Force with the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, where its armor proved thick enough to resist the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun. But after the evacuation of Dunkirk, 97 of these that were sent to Europe were all left behind. Of 140 built, only 3 of these tanks are known to exist today, and all 3 of those are at the Tank Museum. This particular wreck is described as being in very poor condition, but it greets the visitors as they come to the Tank Museum. Not only is it missing most of its road wheels and suspension, but it was actually used as a range target. It was a range target at the former Land Warfare Center in Warminster, and the museum has helpfully painted the holes red to see how much damage it's taken. So why did I choose this funny little tank for one of my top 5 tanks? And if I was going to choose the Matilda 1, why wouldn't I have chose one of the ones that's running inside the museum instead of this little wreck? Well, to be honest, I have quite a soft spot for these little range wrecks. I mean, this tank served its country twice, once while it was in service, and then literally as a target for them to shoot guns. And these little range wrecks, their history is really kind of lost. Once they go out on the range, they're just considered trash, so we don't really know much more than what field it came from. This, to me, is the very embodiment of forgotten history. You know, only 42 of these tanks survived the fall of France, and the fact that this one is around when so many others were gone really means that it's got a story, even if we don't know what this story is. And when I first came to the Tank Museum, this little wreck called to me. I would have taken it home with me if the Tank Museum and my wife would have left me, because this, to me, is exactly what I mean when I say that it's history that deserves to be remembered. So why would I choose as one of my top 5 tanks a tank where someone took the gun off? Well, I'm the history guy and I'm all about forgotten stories. And actually this tank is every tank lover's dream. This is a full-size remote control tank. So you might imagine that at one point all military vehicles are going to be remote control, but this tank, which was modified from a Chieftain Mark I by the Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey, wasn't built to be a remote control battle tank. Rather, Project Crazy Horse was established in 1987 to provide a maneuverable hard target for guided missile operators firing inert anti-tank rounds. Because if you're learning how to fire an anti-tank round, you want a moving target, right? So what they did is they took off the gun, they took off the ammunition storage, they stripped it down, they slaved all the controls, I can see it right here in the driver's compartment, using hydraulics, and they put a camera on top so that one person could sit right down in the middle of this tank and drive the whole tank just looking at a color television set. When it moved to the firing range, the driver would move and operate the tank using a radio control system operated from a modified Alvis Stormer. The remote driver had a link to the tank's camera equipment. The radio control equipment was supplied by the Skyleader company and is based on its model aircraft products. Experiments at Shrewsbury-Ness revealed that the tank could be radio controlled at a range of up to 6 kilometers, but like any remote controlled vehicle, when it got too far away, it could just keep going. A Chieftain gone rogue. To prevent problems, it was fitted with a very reduced fuel tank so that it would run out of petrol before it could get into too much trouble on its own. This is another absolutely unique prototype, but it's interesting not just because it's so unique, but because some of the design elements of this tank are actually quite promising. That idea of putting the crew down in the most defensible space and watching through remote control cameras is quite a modern tank idea. It's incorporated, for example, in the Russian T-14. And even though we have remote controlled flying operating vehicles, the idea of a remote controlled tank is still something that we haven't managed to develop. You know, it's easy to talk about armor and guns, but service vehicles are the unsung heroes of the battlefield because they allow us to keep those armor and guns in the fight. In the course of a battle, lots of tanks are going to get stuck, they're going to break down, they're going to be disabled, and returning them to a fight as soon as possible can make all the difference in that battle. Armored recovery vehicles are built on the chassis of a tank because they are designed to recover and repair vehicles in the midst of combat. A few Mark IVs were modified for towing during the First World War, but the first real armor recovery vehicles were developed during the Second World War when all sides came to recognize their value. The Centurion armored recovery vehicle was developed as ARVs built on earlier designs were not able to move the heavier tanks developed towards the end or after the Second World War. Some modified Centurions were used as recovery vehicles during the Korean War, and a purpose-built model was being produced by 1956. The Centurion Mark II ARV has a basic tank hull with a box-like superstructure in place of the turret that houses the winch. With reduced weight from removing the turret, the ARV has very good power and hill climbing ability. The Centurion proved to be generally a great tank all around and was modified into several types of support vehicles. Centurion ARVs were used by Australia, India, Israel, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, as well as the United Kingdom into the 1980s. The Tank Museum has several ARVs where they aren't just reserved as artifacts, but are used to move the tanks as part of the mission of restoring, maintaining, and displaying the museum's collection. Few can claim to have better opportunity to test how various ARVs compare than the Tank Museum. And the reason that I chose the Centurion ARV as my #1 tank is that the people at the museum tell me that they prefer their Centurion ARV to Chieftain and Challenger ARVs that were designed later. The secret, I'm told, is that the Centurion ARV has a manual gearbox that makes it easier to maneuver. The Centurion tank turned out to be a very good design, one of the best tanks of its era. And one of the ways that we see that is the number of support vehicles that were designed based on the Centurion tank. That the Tank Museum still prefers their Centurion ARV 63 years after it was introduced is a testament to how great this tank is and why I chose it as my #1 tank. You know, people ask me why I collect Army hats, and the answer is simple, because I can't afford to collect Army tanks. I'm the history guy. I hope you enjoyed my take on the top 5 tanks here at the Tank Museum in Bovington. Museums like this really keep history alive so that it doesn't get forgotten. And if you love the Tank Museum, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and support the Tank Museum on Patreon. And check out my channel, The History Guy. History deserves to be remembered.